Have you ever walked out of therapy or maybe a conversation feeling more exhausted than when you walked in? Not because something painful came up, but because you were the one holding it all together, stabilizing the room and the atmosphere. You were listening carefully, you were reflecting back what you were hearing, you were asking thoughtful and clarifying questions, tracking the emotional undercurrents. And somehow, instead of being the one who needed help, you were the one helping, stabilizing, and supporting. If you've ever left a session or conversation feeling drained, confused, and oddly responsible for how the other person felt, then this video is for you. This isn't a video about therapy being bad or useless. Therapy can be life-changing, and I've seen it with my own eyes. But it's not one size fits all, and for certain people, especially for those who are highly intuitive, empathic, sensitive, or cognitively dominant, certain therapeutic models can quietly fail in a very specific way. Not dramatically, but through a quiet reversal of roles. So you keep showing up, you keep explaining carefully, you keep trying to understand yourself and your patterns better, but instead of being guided, somehow you start feeling that you're the one who is guiding, offering perspective, who is supporting, who is carrying emotional weight and space for the reaction that are not even yours. And you leave depleted and still without clarity about this very thing that you came in to work on. And when that happens more than once, many people tend to assume that they are too complex, that they are resistant, or that they're not doing the work properly. But that never sat right with me, so I kept observing and digging, and I was blown away by what I discovered. There were times in my life when I needed support to work through something painful or heavy, or work on a pattern that I could not untangle on my own. So I tried a few therapists over time with clear intention each time. I stayed open, I paid attention to alignment, and I really tried to give it a real chance. But every single time, the same feeling emerged. After a few sessions, something would shift. The therapist would start talking about their own life. Sometimes, most of the session, they would get emotional reactions to my choices, whether it was frustration, sadness, disappointment, even anger, because I did not act the way that they expected. So I would find myself listening to them carefully, holding the space, trying to understand. Basically, I was doing the emotional labor and processing their own emotional material. So at some point, I remember thinking, wait a second, what is happening here? Because I was no longer supported or guided. I was actually the one doing emotional labor, and I was paying for it. At that time, I didn't have language for it. I've heard of transference, and I remember specifically studying that during my master's program, where psychology was my minor. That is when a client projects their own emotions or feelings onto a therapist. But what I didn't know is that there is actually a word for when the opposite happens, when the roles quietly reverse. And it's called countertransference, when a therapist's own unresolved emotional material gets activated by a client. And when it's not well contained, the dynamic flips. And for highly attuned people, this can happen without them saying or doing anything wrong. They don't just feel deeply, they reflect. They amplify what's present in the room. Empaths, intuitives, and deep feelers usually act as clear mirrors, especially in one-on-one spaces. So when you reflect something that someone is not ready to see, usually the dynamic shifts. Not because you did something wrong, but because reflection is asking for integration, and not everyone is ready for that. So In therapy or in any close dynamic, if the container isn't strong enough, the roles can quietly reverse, and that's how you can become the steady one, the one who's listening, who is holding the space, and the one who is supporting emotionally. And this is when it became impossible for me to ignore. There was this one therapist that I worked with for a few months. During the time I was facing a real life decision, something that I've been sitting with for a long time. So I brought it into the session, not to be told what to do, but to explore and understand what was coming up for me. So as we talked, I noticed that she was reacting strongly, not thoughtfully, but emotionally. She kept steering me away from that decision, not by helping me understand myself better, but by projecting her own feelings onto it. And later, I found out that what I was describing was very close to something unresolved in her own family. But at that time, I didn't know that. I just felt it. I felt the pressure, the expectation, and that emotional charge, and I could not explain what was going on. And then when I came back the next session and shared that I actually made the decision, not impulsively, but after deep reflection, she got angry and she told me that she would not be able to continue to work with me. And in that moment, everything clicked for me. I wasn't being supported through my own process. I was being asked unconsciously to manage hers, to protect her emotional world by making a different decision. And when I didn't, the container collapsed. And that's when I understood that it wasn't resistance and it wasn't me not doing the work. It was countertransference, unnamed, uncontained, and honestly, quietly destructive. And I was the one paying the cost. What's important to say here is that it doesn't only happen to empaths, people who are deeply feeling, and those who are intuitive. And it doesn't also mean that therapy is ineffective in general. No. But there is another group of people who can find themselves in a very similar place, not because they absorb too much, but because they understand too well. I'm talking about people whose primary orientation is cognitive rather than emotional. Usually people, if we talk about MBTI types, those would be INTP, INTJ, ENTP, ENTJ, and sometimes ISTP or ESTP. Not because they don't feel, but because they process emotion by trying to understand it first. In therapy, these people can become incredibly articulate. They know what happened, why it happened, how it all connects. They can talk about trauma brilliantly, but inside becomes a loop because they rationalize and intellectualize, and they do believe that they're doing the work because they're saying all the right things. But trauma doesn't resolve through logic, because you can understand your trauma, you can make sense of it, and you can talk about it, but still be living it. Because talking about emotion isn't the same as integrating it. And therapy without integration can just become another layer of distance or avoidance. So whether the pattern shows up because you absorb too much or you understand it too well, the result can be surprisingly similar. You're staying in the room for too long trying to make sense of it, of what is happening. And for empaths, that is especially important because you are usually the one who feels the shift, but you cannot explain it. When you're empathic, intuitive, or the one who feels deeply, you will feel the countertransference before you can name it. You will feel the pull to lean in, to ask more questions, to try to understand, to help, and you don't need to analyze it. But what really matters is the time, because the quicker you interrupt the dynamic, the easier it is for you to exit cleanly. And what really helped me was to learn how to break this pattern as soon as I noticed that that was happening. So for me, when I would sense a shift happening, instead of leaning in and asking more questions, what I usually do, and I mean, I love going down the rabbit hole of human psyche, but instead of that, I would say something neutral, even slightly awkward or blunt. Something like, what's wrong with people these days? Or, yeah, the world is really crazy or strange. I would say this not because I lack empathy. I have a lot of it, much more that I would prefer to carry. But empathy without boundaries can turn into a dumping ground. This is where reciprocity and context start to matter. And there is a difference between intimacy and emotional dumping. Because if there is mutuality, safety, reciprocity to share on both sides, it builds intimacy, closeness, and connection. But if someone you just met dumps and unloads their trauma, their losses onto you, but when you need to share how you feel or be vulnerable and they shut down, that's not intimacy, it's imbalance. And there is another reason why boundaries matter, because when someone feels seen in their vulnerability, especially before trust and reciprocity are established, that can trigger shame and defensiveness. And even sincere help or insight can feel like exposure. This is very often when empathy gets met with anger. That's why collapsing the emotional stream or channel is not only self-protection, but it is also protection for the relationship too. At some point, I stopped asking, why isn't this working? And I started asking, what does my system actually need? And that's when I was drawn intuitively to different ways of working with the nervous system, such as somatic tools, alternative forms of medicine, something that I share in a different video. I'll share a link below. And I was just looking for practices that were not asking me to explain myself better, but rather work with what I was feeling and learning how to hold that and integrate. So don't get me wrong, I've always loved psychology, but at some point it started to feel very limiting to me, because usually it approaches a pattern, a problem, or occurrence through a biological or physiological or cognitive lens. Over time, I began to see how many patterns do not start with us, but they're formed by our family systems, early environments, and just experiences that are carried across generations and even lifetimes. That is also why I do not take any single framework as a single source of truth, whether it's psychology, science, religion, or spirituality on its own. Because when something claims to explain everything from a certain angle, I personally find this limiting. But what really helped me is thinking in systems and just zooming out and seeing how science, religion, psychology, history, meaning all interact together. When I started to explore approaches that do not separate psychology from the body, or science from meaning, or the individual from the lineage, everything began to make much more sense to me. So if you're the one who keeps ending up as the container, the helper, the emotional regulator, it doesn't mean that you are broken. It means that your depth needs discernment. Helping from abundance is generosity, but helping while you're sinking is self-destruction. And discernment is not rejection. It's knowing when your empathy is meant to connect and when it is meant to protect. And that inner knowing is where your authority lives.